Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Gamelier. Thanks a lot for coming out. My name is Jesse Himmelstein. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Game Lab here at the CRI. And I'm very interested in uses for educational games and social games. I mean, games for social causes and for science. And this, the idea for this presentation started when I came across this book, New Rules for Classic Games, okay, which is not that old. It's 25 years old, but already out of print. So it's really hard to find, but you can find used copies like this one. But it's really fantastic. Like it's a real like treasure trove of ideas for games, variants for different games, but also their history. Like it goes really deep into the history of chess and checkers and all these different games. It's really interesting. As well as giving techniques for making your own versions of games. And so, because we often do kind of game jams and what we call micro game jams where people come and we play with game pieces to make our own board games, I thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. We should do something around it, except rather than starting like we normally do with just making our own game with a theme, this time, you know, let's start with old classic games and make new versions of them. So, so just real quickly, why would you bother making remixing games? So for example, this game of life, you can see that it promises over 30 years of family fun. And it looks like these people are having a really good time. But personally, I wouldn't want to have to play life for 30 years in a row. And I could think of at least 3 reasons why you might want to change the games you're playing. One is that games actually do get boring after a while, even if they're really, really good. And what's cool about making variants of games that you otherwise like is that you can kind of make them live again. Like you can make them more exciting. You can add elements of strategy. You can fix a flaw that you didn't like in the original version. You can kind of like, you know, yeah, you can basically adapt the game to the kind of experience that you want to have. Another reason is that when you're in a group of people, it's really fun to make games, obviously. Right? If you come to the Gamelier, you probably like making games, so you probably find that it's also fun. And it's a fun thing to do in a group together. It's fun to be creative in that way. And finally, reading this book made me realize that games, especially the classic games that, you know, like chess and checkers and the like, these are games that are extremely old, that have been passed on from player to player and generation to generation, and have really evolved over time. And there's nothing particularly sacred about the particular version of chess that we happen to play. Right? This is like the version of chess we have has had many variants before it, and it will probably have many variants after. And in fact, it's a lot more like a living tradition, kind of like an oral history or songs that will be passed on from people to others. So we should be part of that, and we should make our own versions of games. All right, so what kind of games are we talking about? Well, let's see. In the book, they talk about word games like your Boggle and your Scrabble. We got card games like poker and, you know, bridge. They talk a lot about. I don't know what the category of games this is. I would call them family type games, so there's probably a different name for it. But basically, like kind of like the games you could play with all ages, you know, like Monopoly or Trivial Pursuit. And of course, a lot of work on strategy games like chess and Risk. And among the strategy games was a chapter on what I found was really interesting on checkers, also known as draw, les dames in French. And I used to play checkers as a kid. I remember playing checkers as a kid, and I remember liking it, and I remember getting very bored with it. And it was very slow, and it wasn't that fun. And quickly I moved on to chess, which was, you know, seemed like a real game with like, you know, many more pieces and that kind of stuff. And I actually found out that the reason this is that the version of checkers I've been playing is the worst version that they have. There's many, many versions of checkers, and the one that came to America is the one that it was most played in England at the time. They call Anglo-American checkers, where you can only jump one square at a time. And the version that people in this room probably play, I imagine, is the international version, in which was invented in France, in which you can, when you jump, the kings can jump many pieces, can jump in the entire row, can move in the entire row like a bishop in chess. And even the men, which are the kind of pawns before they get promoted, can also move backwards. So already there, it gets much, much more interesting. So that's the kind of the beginning of checkers, and after that it gets really crazy. So there's a version called the Italian version where men can't capture kings at all. There's a version called the Turkish version where suddenly they're not on the diagonal pieces anymore. Like they're on all the squares, and they don't move diagonals. Now they move forward, left and right, kind of like well, the cardinal directions, right? And the last row is empty. Then there's the Armenian version, which is like the Turkish version. However, now they can also move diagonal, so now they can move in pretty much every direction. And finally, the Frisian version, well, not finally, there's many, many more. There's a Frisian version, which is like the Armenian version, except now the kings can jump many spaces, but they have to end at the same color as the space that they started, which it's kind of strange and adds all sorts of ideas, the kind of thing you could do. But probably the most interesting version of checkers was invented by a former chess champion called Lasker, and his game is called Lasker, in which it's about building stacks of pieces. And it's really cool. So let me take you through it. So imagine you have two players here. You have the blue and the pink. So when the blue jumps over the pink, they don't take the pink off the board. You take the pink, you put it underneath the blue, and it goes onto the space where you landed. So it starts building like a stack or like a column of pieces, okay? So until then, it's kind of the same thing, right? You just get bigger and bigger stacks that you're moving around the table. Already it's kind of cool, but what's really cool is this. When you, if you jump over a stack, okay, you take the top piece off the stack. And then whoever has the top piece on the remaining of the stack now controls it. So in this play, the blue player now has both stacks to control. So he's actually, so it's very in-depth. It's cool. All right, so now that we kind of got a glimpse into the kind of variety that can exist for just one game, and I gave the very quick version because I didn't want to bore you, but the book contains many, many, many more, and on the internet you can really dive deep into all the variants of checkers. I wanted to give you some tips for making your own game variants. So what I'm calling the 11 paths to fun, inspiration for remixing old games. So here are my 11 ideas that I extracted from the book. Warp the space, change the setup, move the goal, invite more players, be offensive, mess with movement, slice the pie, bid to play, double down, handicap yourself, and lastly, take a chance. So we're going to go one by one. So the first is warp the space. So obviously you can start, the easiest thing you can do with a board game is play on a different board, right? So you can go from a checkerboard to a Go board, for example, and have a lot more room. You can move from hexagonal, you can move to hexagonal boards, so suddenly that changes the way that the pieces move. But you can also use the idea that when you go off the end of one side of the board, you end up on the other. So that you kind of remember from a lot of old video games work that way, but they can play that way with Scrabble, apparently, which is really kind of cool. So you have to figure out how your word's going to form on the other side. And then if you're ready for the new thing in gaming, you can take 3D. And that's right. And there actually is a real thing called 3D chess. In fact, there are many versions of 3D chess. And you don't have to pay a lot of money for a 3D chess set. You can also just take multiple boards and just put them next to each other. Pretend that is 3D. But there's some really cool versions of 3D chess that are interesting, where the middle board is its own dimension that doesn't obey the rules of the other boards, and it gets really kind of wacky. Okay, so that's enough about space. Now there's the setup. So let's take chess again as an example. Okay, one of the very simple things you can do is just change the order of the pieces, right? There's no reason it has to be the way we've learned it. We can move things around. Even cooler is have the board be random every time. So that's a lot kind of like modern board games like Catan or Lost Cities work that way, where through either rolling the die or moving the pieces, you actually are figuring out the rook goes there and then the knight. Bobby Fischer, the famous chess champion who went crazy and ran off, he invented one of these called Chess 960. And even cooler than that, I find, is one where the players themselves build the board. So this is really cool. So basically the way this works is you place all the pawns, and then say white goes first. So white can take any of their pieces, like the rook, place it on one of their squares, and then the black player has to place it on one of them, on the mirror image. And now the black player can pick, say, their bishop and put it on any other board, any other space on their board, and they kind of mirror themselves like that. So you kind of can play off each other's. I mean, if you're good enough, which I'm not, to understand what that will mean for your play, you can do some really interesting things. And the fourth version I want to talk about is called screen chess, where they put down a screen, like a barrier, in the middle of the chess set. And each player has a certain amount of time to set up their pieces any way they want on their side of the board. And then they unveil the screen, and suddenly you're in the middle of a game, and it's craziness. It's really kind of cool. So that gets rid of all the opening setups, anything that you could have memorized if you were really fancy. All right, next one, moving the goal. So let's stick with chess for a little bit. other versions, other goals for the game of chess? Well, what about instead of capturing the king, what if you're just trying to lose all your pieces as quickly as possible? Okay. Or what about you play with multiple kings so that you have two kings. If either of them gets in check, you lose. You could play, there's a very interesting version invented by the author of the book called extinction chess, in which you imagine that each of your type of pieces is like a species. Okay? And if all of your species die, if all the creatures of one of your species dies, you lose. So if the other player gets all your pawns, you lose. Or if they get both your knights, you lose, etc. So it's kind of cool because also it works for the king, of course, right? So getting the king also has you lose, but it's kind of a generalization of chess. And there's versions where totally change it. It's not about capturing other pieces. It becomes a race. So there's a game called Racing Kings where you put you have like use half the board and you have your pieces and you try to race your kings across the board as quickly as possible, given that you can also still get in check and every other rule that is chess, you know. But it totally changes the spirit of the game while keeping a lot of the rules the same. All right, number 4, inviting more players. So there's I'm sure it happens to everyone. Excuse me. You want to play a game and you're the wrong number of people, right? So for example, there's 3 people and you want to play a game for 2. So there's a kind of classic problem for three-player games called the petty diplomacy problem. Okay. So the petty diplomacy problem basically works that if you have 3 players who are all playing, okay, to see who beats the other one. Imagine as soon as one of them starts doing a little bit better than the other ones, well, then the other 2 are going to team up on that one. Okay, so the one who got teamed up on is really hard to fight against 2. So they probably won't be able to do it, and they're probably going to lose. But in the meantime, while they're losing, they're going to inflict some damage on one of the other players, who then will not be able to confront the 3rd player in the end, which leads to a really kind of like unsatisfying play. And so they give a bunch of solutions to this problem. So one way is you just make teams, okay, in advance. Another one, there's a special version of chess that's 3-player, in which there's a way to detect when one player is being attacked by both other players. When that happens, the 3rd player, the player who's being attacked, suddenly gets all these extra pieces. That makes him very powerful, so he can then fight off all the other players who are attacking him. And there's a really cool thing that was used in, yes, that's another, called, oh shoot, what's that from? Chouette, which is a version of backgammon, where you have 1 against all with a rotating team. So the person who's playing all by themselves, they're called in the box. So if it was me against you, I'd be in the box, and you would have a captain, so randomly chosen, okay? And so I would make a move, and then your move would be, you'd have to kind of decide together, but the captain would be in charge, so the captain would make the final choice. And if I win at the end, then the captain just changes on your team. But if you win, the captain takes the place of the player in the box, and the player goes back into the team. So it's a really kind of fun way to make 2 players, but being very asymmetrical. All right, now let's talk about offense versus defense. So there's a classic saying about a best defense being a good offense, and the reverse is also said. But in terms of games, it's true that a lot of defense and not a lot of offense is very boring to watch and boring to play, because it leads to a thing where you're not moving much. So they really encourage trying to push your offense as much as you can. And there's ways you can do that. You can give players multiple moves in a row. So for example, think of chess or checkers if you can move multiple times. Right? If you can move multiple times, then the other player can't really counter every of your moves. Right? You're going to make more impact by doing that. Or you can give special powers. Like sometimes they'll have variants of chess or checkers where you put an extra piece under your piece, and as long as you have that extra piece with you, you can launch a missile or do. There's all sorts of things. Crazy things. There's rockets. There's bombs. There's, you can invent your own rules. And now another thing they do, which is kind of a more general game design principle, is to encourage people to attack. And if you think about it, the rules about pawns being promoted when they reach the last row of chess or checkers is kind of that, right? Like you're encouraging people to do that because there's some reward waiting for them. All right, mess with movement. So in chess in particular, as you can imagine, there are a huge variety of ways that people have invented new pieces. And in checkers, we saw that too. And in fact, there's a whole thing called fairy chess, which is just new pieces that people come up with. And they come up with problems like so the kind of the problems you might have in like a newspaper, at least in the old days, like you'd have to solve, just with pieces that they invented. And there's tons of pieces that you can invent. And I'm not even going to go into it, but they get really crazy. There's two other interesting variants on this about movement. So beyond making pieces, there's also a game called refusal chess, in which one player says, okay, I'm going to move here, and then the other player can say no. Okay. Now, if the other player says no, then the first player has to come up with a new move, but the second player can't refuse a second time. Otherwise, it gets kind of crazy. And there's another version of that called compromise chess, where you're just like, okay, here are the two possibilities. I'll move here or I'll move here. And the other player has to pick. It's kind of interesting psychologically. There's also a way to play simultaneously. So this is obviously hard to do, but you have to write things down on a piece of paper. So you could play, for example, they have versions of Risk like this, where instead of moving, you write down on a piece of paper exactly what you're going to do, and everyone unveils their plans at the same time. And then you have all the armies kind of coming together, and they get in attacks. You have to change the rules to make it work, but it's kind of cool. For video games, obviously, that's a lot easier to do. All right, let's talk about pi. Okay, so the next 4 rules are about balancing games. Okay, making them as making sure there's the same level of difficulty for each player. So for these kind of pure strategy games, like your chess, your Go, that kind of stuff, there can actually be like significant advantages to the player who goes first, or the player who can place their pieces in very key strategic positions. Okay, and there's a bunch of rules that they have in this book to make that process fair. So one of them is called the pi rule, which is based on the classic, I don't know what it's called, I guess, idea for how to have 2 children share a pie. If you've heard that, so you have one child cut the pie, and the second child gets to pick if they want this piece or that piece, right? And so the first child obviously is in their interest to cut as evenly as possible so that they're not going to lose out on the deal. And you can use this for games by, for example, let's say one player is playing white and they place their stones in a particular way. Then the player playing black can either play their stones, or they can say, oh, actually, I'm going to switch sides with you, and I'm going to take the white side now. It becomes too advantageous. So that makes sure that the first player doesn't do anything that's too advantageous. And yeah. So another technique in the same idea is around bidding. So this is a game called Fox and Geese. It's Scandinavian. It's an asymmetrical game in which one player plays the foxes, which are the red pieces. There's just 1 or 2 usually. And the other player plays all the sheep, which are all the yellow pieces. And so the fox, as you might imagine, can eat the sheep. And they do this kind of like in checkers, like they jump over the piece. And so the fox, to win, the foxes need to eat all the sheep. For the sheep to win, they have to surround the foxes so that the foxes can't move. Okay? So it might seem that, in fact, this is tilted toward the foxes, but in fact, if people are good enough, apparently it always comes out to the geese. Okay, so this becomes a problem too, because then it's not interesting. If you play the fox, you know you're going to lose against a good player. So another thing you can do is you can add bidding to it. So you'll say, instead of saying, I want to play the geese, you say, okay, I can win with the geese in 10 moves. And then the other player says, oh, I can win with the geese in 9 moves. You have to say, okay, can I win in 8 moves, or am I going to beat them when they do 9 moves? And so you might recognize that rule from a lot of card games. Works that way, right? When you bet for tricks. It's that same idea. And you kind of bring up the level of competition to the point where it gets really difficult for everyone. And this is also really cool for games like charades and Pictionary, games where you have to make your team discover something in a certain amount of time, because you can bid for time. So the way this works is if you have 2 teams playing Pictionary, or charades, whatever, you have one person from each team come up and look at a card together, and they see the word. Okay? And then the first player says, okay, I can get my team to do it in 90 seconds. And the other player says, I can get my team to do it in 60 seconds. And you keep going back and forth until one player says the bid, the other one can't match, and then there you go. You start with that. So it gets, again, to the point where it gets really difficult for people. Okay, last version of this, to make it super even, why not just play the same game twice at the same time, each of you playing a different side. So in this version, we're playing Fox and Geese. The yellow player is playing the geese on one and the fox on the other, and the blue's doing the same. They're both playing at the same time. So you move one and then you move the other. And in fact, there's different versions of this where you're not even playing the same game. Like you could play Monopoly on one and Fox and Geese on the other. You could do backgammon on one and Monopoly on the other and use the same dice. I mean, it gets kind of crazy. Okay. All right, the next thing, so up to there I was talking about the pi rule and the bidding, all that. That's about trying to make things as even as possible. But often when you're playing games, one player is just better than the other one, and it's not that fun to play. It's not that fun to play for the person who's better. It's not that fun to play with the person who knows they're going to lose from the beginning. And so often what you actually want to do is trying to make it more even. And for this, the best solution is really handicapping. So handicapping, I mostly know from golf, because my dad plays a lot of golf, and he talks about his handicap going up or down. And so in golf, it's kind of cool. He can go play against somebody who's much better than him or much worse than him, and they're both playing really hard, and they're both playing together, but at the same time, they're playing for different things, right? He has a different score he's trying to hit than his partner. And you can do the same type of thing in board games, which I didn't know. So for example, apparently in Go, they have a very sophisticated system called the Katabon system, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, in which if you beat another player 3 times in a row, then you're considered a level of handicap higher than them. And so when they play against you, they get an extra stone. And so in this diagram I had, the orange player is better than the blue player is better than the green player. So if the yellow player played the green, then he would give 2 stones to the green. Right? And if he beat him again, he'd give him 3 stones next time, until they reached a point where the green player is able to beat him once in a while. So it's kind of cool. Once again, it creates a nice balance where everyone's still playing to the best of their abilities. And I think it's kind of a shame. I feel like in a lot of games, in a lot of sports, we don't use handicapping enough. Like there's kind of this weird mentality that you have to be, it has to be even. But in fact, what we're going for is to have a good time. We're trying to push everyone to their best abilities. So in fact, handicapping probably makes a lot of sense. It could be applied for a lot of games. All right, last one. It's about luck. So luck in games in general is very important. And Richard Garfield, the inventor of magic, among other things, has given some great talks where he kind of argues for putting more luck into games and not being so obsessed with having pure strategy. In particular, one reason that's really good is that it leads to more interesting challenges quickly. Like you don't have to wait until chess until you get to a really weird situation you've never seen before. With enough luck, things will just randomly end up in situations you haven't seen. So some tricks to add chance to games, to add luck. Here's a version of chess called dice chess, okay, which seems like a contradiction in terms. But you play like regular chess, except before you play, you roll a die. And so if it comes out like a 1 or a 2, then you move a pawn. If it comes out a 3, well, you move a queen and then the bishop, etc. And so you're still picking your moves. It's still high strategy, but you don't have a choice in which pieces that you're moving. Another really cool thing like this is called a doubling cube. I didn't know this. This is apparently in backgammon. It's quite popular. And in backgammon, the way this works is that normally if you're playing against another player multiple times or in a tournament, the game is worth like 1 point for the beginning. Okay. So you're playing, and if you suddenly think that you're going to win, you can give the player this doubling cube, and you put the 2 up. So he sees it. So this, then the other player has to decide. So either they're going to double the stakes, and so the game is now worth 2 points, or they can refuse. But if they refuse, then they're just losing immediately, and you just lose the 1 point. Okay, so imagine they accept it. Okay, so now the game is worth 2 points. Now their turn, if they start to think, actually, I'm doing pretty good, they can now turn it to 4 and give it back to you. And now you're like, oh, because if you accept, you double. Now it's worth 4 points. So if you lose, it's really bad. But if you say no, then you just give them 2 points directly, and you never even try. And so obviously it keeps going up and up. And that's really cool because you can apply that to pretty much any game, right? It's not particular to backgammon. Okay, what about removing chance? So maybe you want to remove chance because you want to take out some things that were luck and put them into more meaningful choices for the players, let's say. There's a really cool technique that came out of what they describe as postal play, which I never heard of before. But apparently people used to, and perhaps still do, play games via the mail. They would take postcards and they would play chess, for example, and they would write down where they moved. And they would send the postcard to the other player, and then the other player, when they got it, would write down their move, and then they send the postcard back and forth. And so this became, okay, this works for chess, but for games that involve luck, like rolling die, it's really hard. Because who's going to believe you, right? Like, oh, I rolled double 6s again, It became a problem. So the way they did this is they decided, well, let's just write down all the possible throws. So this is like, if I had two die, I have 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, all the way through 6, 6. If I want to use one, I just use whichever one I want, and I cross it out. So like I'll use the 2 and the 2. I cross it out. And then I use the 6 and the 6 and the 1, and I cross it out. And you just keep crossing it out until you until you have none left, and then you start again. Another option is these things called rethrow options. So basically, in this version, you diminish luck by giving people a certain number of tokens, and if they don't like what they rolled, well, they just spend their token to use it again. So they can spend their token, they get to roll again. So it reduces luck, but there's still some strategy and some choice involved in whether or not you're going to use it. All right, and with that, I will end my list of 11 paths to making fun remix of games. And just to say, in conclusion, that there are many ways to remix games. Hopefully I've shown that. And you shouldn't be afraid to do it. And after this, I'd like to try out some variants that were here and then make up our own. All right. Thank you very much.